The studio behind hit films like Hereditary and The Whale, A24 delivers a war action drama that feels all too relevant. Directed by Alex Garland, Civil War is set in a dystopian future USA where a team of military-embedded journalists races against time to reach Washington, D.C. before rebel factions descend upon the White House. The movie has garnered mixed reviews despite achieving a Rotten Tomatoes audience score of 70% and a IMDb rating of 7.2 out of 10. With a runtime of 109 minutes, this film attempts to explore the issues of polarization and division in today's society through the lens of journalism and war. It's clear that war can be an inevitable conclusion to continuous tension. In this episode, we examine the stylistic and narrative methods used to emphasize the film's message, reflecting today's social climate. Does the film accomplish its goals, or lose the plot along the way? But before we get to the review, if you enjoy this type of content, hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Also, hitting the notification bell will alert you when we drop new content. If you've already seen the movie and don't need a recap of the events, feel free to skip ahead to the film commentary section of this review. Now, let's get critical. A civil war has engulfed the United States, led by an authoritarian federal government under a third-term president facing secessionist movements. Despite the president's claim of imminent victory, it is expected that Washington, D.C. will fall to the Western forces, led by Texas and California. Veteran war photographer Lee Smith and journalist Joel, along with their mentor Sammy, plan to interview the isolated president. Joined by aspiring photojournalist Jesse Cullen, they head to the front line in Charlottesville, Virginia. The group encounters dangers at a gas station where Jesse witnesses men torturing alleged looters. Lee diffuses the situation by photographing the guard with his victims. They document combat as secessionists attack a loyalist-held building, with Lee mentoring Jesse on her photography. Spending the night at a refugee camp, they pass through a town trying to ignore the war. In a sniper battle, Jesse's skills improve as she becomes desensitized to violence, even asking Lee if she would photograph her death. The group runs into foreign reporters Tony and Bohai, but in an unfortunate turn of events, a militia executes the reporters. Sammy saves the others, but is shot in the process. He eventually succumbs to his injuries. Traumatized, they reach the Western Forces base in Charlottesville, learning that Washington, D.C. is largely undefended. Joel lashes out over Sammy's death while Lee struggles to document it. They join the WF assault on D.C., with Jesse taking risks for photos and Lee experiencing combat fatigue. The presidential limousine is intercepted, but the trio enters the White House suspecting the president is still inside. Inside the White House, an attempted negotiation by the remaining Secret Service turns into a firefight. Jesse captures Lee's death as she saves Jesse. Jesse continues to the Oval Office, where soldiers prepare to execute the president. Joel gets a final quote from the president before allowing the execution, and Jesse photographs the soldiers posing with the president's corpse. Kirsten Dunst as the lead character Lee Smith was praised for her performance. The supporting cast, including Wagner Moura as Reuters journalist Joel and Kaylee Spaney as Jesse Cullen, an inspiring young photographer, also delivered commendable performances. The film premiered at South by Southwest on March 14, 2024, receiving favorable reactions from the audience and positive reviews from critics. Alex Garland expressed his desire to highlight the growing divide in the world, using the US as a backdrop. Garland began writing the film in 2020 during the pandemic when he noticed the mistrust in news outlets and the rise of misinformation and how this led to mass manipulation and polarization. He aimed to emphasize the media's objective bias and propagandist methods that push the agenda of one party over another. However, these messages and themes, while extremely topical and far-reaching, are overshadowed by the film's style and direction. Garland introduces journalists at three distinct stages of their careers. Stephen McKinley Henderson portrays Sammy, a veteran journalist for the New York Times and Lee's mentor, who is at the end of his career. Lee and Joel represent seasoned, experienced individuals, while Jesse is just beginning her journey. The film uses these characters not only to emphasize the different phases of life, but also to show how journalism should remain unbiased and depict events as they unfold. However, Civil War leans too heavily into this theme, neglecting the need for a coherent plot and story. Garland forgets to use the characters to deliver a broader picture of the unfolding events and the reasons behind the dystopian America's devolution. The movie focuses so intensely on the characters' involvement in the conflict and its effects on them that it fails to provide the audience with a wider scope. Civil War aims to serve as a cautionary tale, warning of the consequences of a nation torn apart. The film seeks to remind the audience of a time when journalism was real and true, like during the Vietnam War, when people were shown the reality of war and could potentially end it altogether. In summary, while Civil War successfully highlights the challenges and biases in journalism and the dangers of misinformation, its heavy focus on character-driven themes at the expense of broader storytelling diminishes its impact. The film struggles to balance its thematic goals with the need for a compelling plot, ultimately leaving some of its powerful messages obscured. For what it's worth, the film is well shot and highly stylistic. However, it is misleading in that it uses the Civil War as merely a backdrop to tell the story of journalism during wartime. Advertised as an action war movie, it ultimately features more drama than war. The audience is left confused about who is on which side and who is fighting whom until the Western forces is introduced. Adding some context to the war, despite the attempt in unbiased journalism, would have helped the audience understand the perspective from which each action scene is viewed. While war journalists are expected to present viewpoints from all sides, the film primarily shows the perspective of the Western forces. The loyalists, who are defending Washington, D.C., are stated to kill reporters on sight, and with no further explanation, limits the narrative. It's further perplexing how California and Texas form the Western forces given their opposite political and social standings. This improbable alliance, which Garland did not address, definitely requires explanation, along with the fact that none of the other factions are discussed. The movie leaves more questions than answers, leading to audience frustration. It is difficult to reconcile the events around the characters with their personal struggles because the narrative provides so little context. The lack of character development makes it hard to connect with them, as they are portrayed more as symbols than as individuals. The plot about reaching the White House to get a story before the Western forces arrive to kill the president doesn't make much sense. The power of succession, which would make the vice president the new president upon the president's death, is never discussed, leaving a significant gap in the story's logic. But I guess a nation under fascism would not have a power of succession. The movie should address what replaces the fascist rule once it is toppled and how democracy was dismantled. I love most A24 movies, and I had such high hopes for this film, but ultimately I give Civil War a critical rating of C-.